Hi, everybody, and welcome again to Innovation Insights, where we're talking with founders, investors, service providers, people who are helping bring innovation from the lab and into the market, because not enough of that is happening today. I'm very honored to have a good friend, Farid Manshaii, who's got a number of things going on. I can't keep up with the guy. He's so busy. But I mean, this is a true entrepreneur. He was born an entrepreneur. I could tell the minute I talked to him that he's got that entrepreneur blood in him. And Farid, why don't you just introduce yourself? Tell us a couple of things you're working on.
Yes. So, hi, everyone. My name is Farid. I am the founder and CEO of Recalivape. We are developing an adaptive e-cigarette to taper people off nicotine addiction. And then after that, I'm also developing the Type Research Institute. This is a new nonprofit research model that should accelerate research because we're trying to get away from the grant model of relying on government funding. On top of that, I have a couple other projects, including but not limited to what I have behind me right here and setting up this entire research lab. But yeah, those are the two most important projects at the moment. So I'll pass it back to you, Jay.
Sweet. So tell us, before we get into the questions about innovation, tell us about Recalivape and how you came up with the idea, and give us a little more detail around it, where you're at with that as well.
Yeah. So around 2022, I was taking an electrical engineering class at UCLA. It was my first engineering class, and I'm bored in the class. So I'm sitting and I'm like thinking about how certain problems are being solved. My mentor just passed away. He actually helped people with smoking cessation and also helped people with COPD. And we developed basically an adaptive breathing device. And this was really interesting to me. And I was thinking about how do you solve a problem like this? Because a year ago, like in 2021, I asked him, how do you get people to quit vaping? Because this is a huge problem. And someone at UCLA asked me about this. And what happened was that he said the best ways are either quitting cold turkey or using the nicotine cessation tools that are out there, like a nicotine patch or a nicotine lozenge. So me not paying attention in that electrical engineering class, I was sketching out essentially a really rudimentary design of how the multi-cartridge e-cigarette would work at that time. And then I reached out to a bunch of professors at UCLA. I had one professor that responded. It was Dr. Edith London, and she is my mentor, and she's amazing. She basically was able to guide me on how to basically build this out because you have an idea. You want to build this thing, but what do you do next? And it took about a year and a half, but then I started writing my research protocol, which is what I'm using for my PhD. We actually upgraded that research protocol pretty substantially. And then after that, in the meantime, it was mainly just building the hardware and testing it and basically pivoting several times in order to actually figure out the lowest cost to get to market. And most other companies are basically spending a lot of capital on clinical trials, and it's rather problematic when you actually are going to go and you're going to build your device. You get it through the FDA, you get that approval, and then you run your clinical trial. And then after that, you have to go and run that through the FDA to basically go and get essentially an approval to use that device or to use that software. So it's like a two-stage step. So that's something that we were trying to figure out. And essentially, the best way to do that was actually with our pivot, which is basically the smart module. And this actually attaches to any e-cigarette and allows us to basically monitor the puff topography of anyone, essentially. And it connects to basically our application that we're still testing right now. And this would allow us to basically collect data at a lower cost than basically having them come in, which is how most researchers do it, where you have to come in to the lab, you have to check in, and that has a lot of cost and it has a higher chance of people dropping out. And this is something that was really interesting because you realize that entrepreneurship is not basically a linear pathway. It's always basically figuring out things on the fly. So yeah.
Yep. And I've been with you on this journey for a while, and I've seen some of the struggles you've had. And let's dive into one of those, and that's finding the people that you work with that you can trust that actually can get the job done. Could you go into some of the things that you found as far as friction, as far as getting the product made, getting the prototype design, some of the things that you've had to deal with that?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is basically finding the right founders first to work with you or the right team. And this is something that I struggled with pretty heavily early on in the project, not just for this project, but for other projects as well. And it is essentially, you don't want to find founders or basically people that you want to work with based off of interests. You want to find them off of shared values. If you find someone with shared values, even if, for example, the project like falls apart, you're able to basically still work with them on other things and you're able to take off other projects because that is essentially the nexus of how to build stuff. What I am noticing more and more today is that a lot of Gen Zers are essentially they're essentially going and they're finding people based off of interest, and then the project will fizzle out, and then after that it dies. So that's a huge problem. But then on top of that, it's also execution and figuring out what to delegate. I heard this constantly at UCLA. You need to delegate. You need to delegate. You need to delegate. But you need to know what you're delegating as well. This is something that we're going to see a huge problem with AI today as well. Is you're offsetting a good chunk of stuff that you don't even know personally to an AI model, which is prone to hallucinations. And then what happens is that after you're going to ask it for advice, you're going to take that as basically like the word of God, which is horrible. And then what happens is that basically you're never going to understand what's being done if there's a better pathway. This is something that actually I realized recently when it came to taxes, and you know about this. I went through Title 26 of the tax code. And the main reason is because if you understand how basically you could best route capital, best essentially loan capital is like the best way to do it. You don't want to contribute capital, but loaning capital is like super ideal because what happens is that you, one, can actually pull back the capital when you need it. Two, basically it's tax free if you do it properly, like up to a certain threshold, whatever the expenses are. And then three, basically, you can actually take a very small amount of capital and drag it out longer. And that's essentially what startups need to do rather than relying on venture capital early on, because then you dilute too quickly. And then that becomes a huge problem as well. So, yeah.
And one of the ways that you figured out some of this stuff is by setting up, and my friend Marty's done a similar thing. You have kind of a holding company, and then you're taking the research that you're developing, and when it turns into an idea, you spin it out into another company that is wholly owned by your holding company, and then that operates kind of on its own. Are you going to be building individual teams around each idea? How's that going to work?
That's the general thought process I have at the moment, but also I would like to use the previous expertise that has been proven to basically transfer them over. So this is something that I'm working on right now, and it's essentially setting up a dashboard where you could see every single project essentially like a living Gantt chart. And what happens is that if, for example, you need someone that is like an electrical engineer, you can basically fork off that part of the project to them. And then what happens is that they define their rate, whatever, and then after that you send them a contract, and then it basically is going to revert back and the Gantt chart will update. And if, for example, you need a new contractor or a new engineer, basically like then you would look for them. That is a better way to go about it because I'd rather work with people that are proven versus people that are not proven.
You're building your own AI in your lab, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're creating your own LLMs to work within that, and you're gonna be
That's actually that's
firewalled
actually
off?
a side project. So the LLM itself is something that I'm working on. It's a pivot from basically a previous startup that I had and I closed down and then I'm going to relaunch it. And that was basically an AI platform for objective news. That getting to market was very interesting overall. I think you know the ordeals of what I had to go through, which was I essentially was building a product that I was not able to market test properly because there is a huge moat around basically the legacy news channels. So there is that. And then also it's really hard to monetize something like that unless you use ads. And that is still not very, what is the best word? It's not sustainable to say the least. So there is that. What I'm talking about is basically an orchestration layer. So basically you would have multiple basically LLMs working together in sequence essentially. And these LLMs already exist and you can use them to actually build this out. And that's essentially what is essentially like needed today. You need to build your own frameworks. What we're seeing more and more in startups is people are basically taking frameworks that already existed and they keep reusing them over and over and over. And it's frameworks that basically can pertain to software. It's even ideologies. And you need to come up with your own framework, your own ideas of how you're basically getting from point A to point B using first principles. This is just really important to do. So.
If there's one thing, we've got an audience of other founders, maybe some investors, different people who are interested in innovation. If there's one thing that could help you out from the audience, what would that be? What would your ask be?
My ask would be I would like to hear more from founders on their experience, essentially, and from investors, what are they looking for? Because one thing I've noticed with investors today, and this is something that is very problematic, is it's based off of hype cycles. It's not on fundamentals anymore. And this is something that basically we need to get back to when it comes to startups. We see startups that are basically raising enormous amount of capital for an AI wrapper that didn't need that amount of capital. And you could say that they're scaling using that capital, but there is no proof that basically they can. And then they get bought out by a PE firm or basically some entity and they basically are dead. You want to have fundamentals backed. And that's what I'm trying to figure out is what are basically venture capitalists looking for today? What are basically private investors looking for? Because the thing that you need to look at is basically fundamentals, and I would like to hear what those are from them.
And then I have obviously, if you're talking with other founders too, then the whole idea of connecting with like-minded people is all of a sudden a new idea pops up. It's the old mastermind idea. When you have two or more people talking together, then another,
You have that synergy.
yeah,
And this is something that a mentor told me about. So Dr. Type, the mentor I brought up that worked on the COPD device with me, his mentor and him, and it was like three other people, they would get together and they would have this synergistic like connection where they're able to actually bounce ideas continuously off of each other. And they're able to actually keep iterating and building stuff. But to have that, you need to have one, shared values, which
yeah.
will form trust. And then two, basically, you need to actually be able to converse without risking people thinking that you're offending them. And this is another thing in the startup field. If you are going, I've gone to several startup events where basically when you talk to founders about what they're doing and you're trying to give feedback to them, or basically you're just sharing what your thoughts are on it, they get very offended
Yeah.
when you share your feedback on it. And the thing is, it's just like you have to speak bluntly. I like the more German approach to this, where you speak very bluntly about stuff, and then basically it's like that's how it is. It's a very direct way, or maybe the East Coast. It's also an East Coast thing. So
Well, nobody wants to hear that their baby's ugly, right? So,
yeah, fair
and
point.
that's when I'm an entrepreneur as well, and when we have our idea and we're nurturing it, we tend to start focusing on it. And then
Mhm.
the next thing you know, it becomes so important to us that you don't want to hear. And I'm not saying criticism, I'm just saying an objective third party opinion. You
Yeah.
just don't want to hear it because that doesn't mesh with what you've got going in your mind as far as what this baby's going to look like. So
Well, I
that's a
think it's
very good point.
I think it's also separating the idea from basically the person. And the problem that we're seeing more and more is people are not able to separate the two. In the
Right.
past, one thing I've noticed with my older mentors is they shred the idea, but the person isn't offended because they know it's just very given in the subtext that this is how it is. We're going to shred your idea. We're going to poke holes, as many holes as we can. You can agree or you can, and then basically you're going to create a better or stronger idea out of it. It's very hard to do that today when people basically are going to take every single criticism as basically you're criticizing them versus basically criticizing the idea. I think this is a generational shift that we're seeing more and more as well with today
All right.
media. So
Well, Farid, I really appreciate your being on the show. You've brought up a lot of points. It's been very good, and I'm sure our audience is going to get some out of it. I want to thank you for being on. We're going to have a screen come up at the end of the show that'll actually provide your contact information. So if anyone wants to get a hold of you, they can. And I wish you the best of luck. And obviously, I'm going to be following your journey because I love what you're doing.
got it. Thank you so much, Jay. Great to be
All
on.
right. Thanks.